Good day. In this day, I'm going to talk about what's the absolute best way to answer the question of how would you deal with a conflict inside your team. And right from the start, I asked ChatGPT to answer these questions, and I thought, there's some things that could certainly improve with the type of answers they recommend and in the overall methodology, right? But let's start with the factual information here. So whenever a candidate is asked a hypothetical question, how would you deal with a conflict? In my experience, 95% of the time they would give an hypothetical type of answer. Okay, you might have heard it's a good idea to use frameworks in your answers. So basically people would do something online. Hey, whenever I have a conflict, I have this 5-step framework to deal with it. All right, so let's take the first example that ChatGPT recommends, by the way. Whenever there's conflict, I first identify which mode of the Thomas Kilmann conflict model framework applies: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, or accommodating. For instance, recently two teammates disagreed on data validation methods. I identified that one was collaborating and the other one was competing. And then we discussed the compromise, which eventually worked out. Right, so it's using a framework, it's using a hypothetical answer, even with a small example at the end. So you'll notice that this answer sounds a bit academic, MBA style. It's systems thinking. You're showing your reasoning around handling conflict. But let me ask you this: is dealing with conflict a core competency required for your role? Is this degree of proficiency of handling conflict required in your role? Because in my experience, except if you're applying for a VP role or an executive director or a very senior type of manager, the expectation is of your conflict management abilities, or conflict resolution abilities, I should say, is quite limited, right? So basically, if the expectation for the type of role you're applying for is quite limited, then it means you shouldn't go as far as to show your mental model or even have frameworks for dealing with conflict, but rather sell yourself as being able to efficiently handle conflict by previously dealing with conflicts successfully. Right? So what I'm pitching to you here is the best way to sell yourself in job interviews if questions are hypothetical is behaviorally, that is using past experiences that would represent predictors of success in your future role, right? Let me put it a bit more direct if you want. No one cares about your systems thinking around conflict resolution in job interviews. Again, with exceptions if you're applying for a VP role, which I know rarely the case, right? So if the best way is to sell yourself, even if the question is hypothetical, is behavioral, then let's take an example of a behavioral style answer. Right, for an analyst role. I try to clarify the goal everyone is working towards before diving into the disagreement. For example, during a recent project, two analysts on my team disagreed on which data cleaning approach to use. I spoke to each privately to understand the reasoning and then brought them together to align on the business goal. By focusing on the outcome we needed to achieve, we agreed on a combined approach that improved both accuracy and efficiency. Is a specific example for an analyst role that would sell themselves as someone having previously experienced conflicts in their previous roles and therefore, as a predictor of success in their future role, right? So this is 10 times better than presenting your model of your framework of dealing with conflict resolution, right? Yet still, there's something slightly weird with this answer, because this answer, if you look at it more carefully, it doesn't really the answer of a hands-on type of role, because it's not a functional type of conflict that you're resolving. You're resolving a conflict between two other colleagues. So you were just mediating there. Yes, you might have used your subject matter expertise because you needed it to mediate and to understand each other's points of view, but it wasn't really your conflict at the end of the day, right? So notice here this would be for a more hands-off type of individual, rather a hands-on type of individual, which is most likely the case for an analyst role. right? So my point is here, this example could definitely improve if the type of experience would share would be a functional type of conflict, into which your subject matter expertise would be directly involved, and you have a conflict directly with someone instead of mediating one, right? So there, let's give an example that is finally a more convincing, I would say a great example, this time for an individual contributor role of a PM. When I encounter a disagreement with my manager, I focus on aligning around the objectives and data rather than positions. For instance, in a previous role, my manager wanted to prioritize a feature launch by the end of the month, but my data suggested the current version wouldn't meet key user metrics. So I first clarified the business goal and gathered supporting data. Then I scheduled a short discussion with my manager, presenting the data and proposing a phased rollout that met both timing and quality goals. In the end, we agreed to postpone it, and the launch was successful without compromising user experience. Okay, so this is what I would call a great example, especially for individual contributor roles and especially for hands-on types of roles. It's an example when you are right, you didn't compromise, you didn't have to compromise, because the data show that, hey, there's too great of a risk if we implement your features, and you convince them this way, right? Also, this is a functional type of conflict. It was the PM's responsibility for this type of decision. So it also showcases beyond your conflict resolution, also your functional expertise for the role that you're applying for, right? Also, this is a quite simplified example. It doesn't contain any actual metrics because this is YouTube. So if I would give you a 2-page answer, you wouldn't watch it for this long, right? So long story short, how would you deal with a conflict? I know it's awkward because the question is hypothetical toward the future to answer it with the previous experience. But what I'm telling you here is that the best way to sell yourself in these job interviews, even with hypothetical interview questions, is behavioral, right? And if you're here to the end, I'd also like to share with you a quick table which shows the expectations for conflict resolution based on the type of role you're applying for. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.